The blow landed without ceremony, without hesitation, without a single witness to protest. Admiral Garrett Morrison didn't pause to consider protocol, didn't announce his intentions, didn't offer Lieutenant Commander Rachel Sterling a moment to defend herself. His knuckles struck her cheek in the suffocating quiet of the secured briefing chamber at Crimson Bay Naval Command, the sound echoing like a judge's gavel sealing a verdict that had never seen trial. She didn't cry out. She didn't stumble backward. She didn't even flinch. What she did was infinitely more dangerous. She smiled. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What Admiral Morrison couldn't have known as pain shot through his hand from the impact was that the woman standing before him wasn't just another subordinate officer who dared to question his authority. She wasn't some desk-bound analyst who'd grown too comfortable with her security clearance. And she definitely wasn't the type of person who absorbed violence and walked away in silence. What she was someone who'd spent the last decade in locations that existed only in classified files, completing missions that required a very different kind of authorization entirely. Before we dive deeper into this explosive confrontation, drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from today. And if stories about justice against abuse of power resonate with you, make sure that subscribe button is hit, because what you're about to witness will show you exactly why respect earned through fear isn't respect at all. It's borrowed time. By the time Admiral Morrison's two personal security officers registered the sharp crack of knuckles against flesh and began their instinctive movement toward the disturbance, Lieutenant Commander Sterling had already calculated the exact distance between Morrison's exposed solar plexus and her right elbow. By the time they'd taken their second step into the room, she had already identified the precise pressure point beneath his left ear that would send him crashing to the polished marble floor. And by the time their hands moved toward their standard-issue sidearms, Admiral Garrett Morrison was unconscious on the deck of Crimson Bay's most secure briefing facility. Not one person in that room, not the security detail, not the surveillance equipment, not even Morrison himself, had seen exactly how a decorated three-star admiral had been neutralized in under 3 seconds by someone half his size. Now, before we reveal the surgical precision of the technique that left a career military officer unconscious faster than most people can blink, and the words Lieutenant Commander Sterling spoke that made his elite bodyguards freeze with their weapons halfway drawn, drop us a comment predicting what you think happened when Admiral Morrison finally regained consciousness. Smash that like button if you believe some people need to learn the hard way that rank doesn't grant you permission to lay hands on anyone. And hit subscribe, because today's story proves that sometimes the most lethal person in the room is the one everyone assumes is helpless. The morning had begun like countless others at the Crimson Bay Naval Command Center. This sprawling fortress of reinforced concrete and bulletproof glass rose from the rocky coastline of northern Maine, where classified operations were planned behind triple encrypted doors and military careers were forged or shattered with a single administrative decision. The salt air mixed with diesel fumes from the harbor, creating that distinctly military atmosphere of power projection and bureaucratic precision. This wasn't some recruiting office where starry-eyed teenagers came to chase patriotic dreams. This was where strategy took shape, where decisions rippled across oceans, where the kind of people who never appeared in newspaper photographs gathered to discuss operations that would never make the evening news. Lieutenant Commander Rachel Sterling had been summoned to Conference Room Delta 7 for what her orders described as an urgent consultation on overseas intelligence protocols, standard military language that could mean anything from a routine briefing to a career-ending interrogation, depending entirely on who was asking the questions and why they needed answers. Her dress uniform was regulation perfect, every ribbon positioned with mathematical precision, every crease sharp enough to cut paper, everything exactly as the manual specified for someone with her exemplary service record. What wasn't regulation was the way Admiral Morrison had been watching her since she'd entered the room 23 minutes earlier, not the professional assessment of a superior officer evaluating a subordinate's qualifications. Something else entirely, something that activated every survival instinct she'd developed during years of operations in places where predators wore many different uniforms. She'd encountered that look before, in locations where men confused their authority with ownership, where they mistook command presence for the right to claim whatever caught their attention. Admiral Morrison was 64 years old, silver-haired and square-shouldered, with the kind of distinguished appearance that photographers favored for recruitment campaigns. 3 stars gleamed on his collar, representing 32 years of service and a chest full of commendations that spoke to a career spent navigating political currents and managing public perception. What his official biography carefully omitted was the pattern of female officers mysteriously requesting reassignments from his command, the complaints that somehow never quite reached formal channels, the way conversations died when he entered rooms full of uniformed women. Lieutenant Commander Sterling knew nothing of this history as she sat across from him in the mahogany-paneled chamber, reviewing classified documents on her secure tablet, while he performed an elaborate charade of studying intelligence summaries. What she knew was that his attention kept wandering from the papers to places it had no business being, that his questions bore no relationship to overseas operations, and that his decision to dismiss his aide and secure the door had nothing whatsoever to do with classification protocols. The transformation was about to begin, though neither participant yet understood their true roles in what would follow. When Admiral Morrison asked her to explain what he called her attitude problem regarding his oversight of her latest mission report, Lieutenant Commander Sterling responded with the kind of direct, factual clarity that a decade of classified operations had taught her was essential. No embellishment, no emotional language, just truth delivered with the precision of someone who'd learned that in certain situations, clarity could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. She'd told him that his questions revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of the tactical situation she'd been reporting on, that his suggested modifications would have compromised operational security, and that perhaps he should review the classified annexes more thoroughly before offering strategic input on missions he hadn't participated in. That was when Morrison called it disrespect. That was when he stood up from behind his imposing desk, walked around to where she sat, and informed her that junior officers who couldn't demonstrate proper deference to their superiors needed to be taught lessons they wouldn't forget. And that was when Admiral Garrett Morrison made the catastrophic mistake that would end his military career. The Crimson Bay Naval Command Center sprawled across 87 acres of Maine's rugged coastline, its modernist architecture rising from granite cliffs that had witnessed centuries of maritime warfare. Unlike the sterile government buildings of Washington, D.C., this facility projected raw military power, reinforced concrete bunkers connected by underground tunnels, communications arrays that could coordinate global operations, and security measures that made the Pentagon look welcoming by comparison. This wasn't a place where politicians came to pose for photographs. This was where America's real maritime business got conducted, behind blast-proof doors and electromagnetic shielding that prevented any unauthorized surveillance of conversations that shaped naval strategy across 3 oceans. The morning fog rolled in from the Atlantic, wrapping around the facility's perimeter towers, where armed sentries maintained vigilant watch over approaches that could conceal threats ranging from terrorist infiltrators to foreign intelligence operatives. The air carried the scent of salt spray mixed with electronics and filtered air that marked every high-security installation built in the last 2 decades. Building 7 housed the most sensitive briefings, its upper floors restricted to personnel, with clearances that required background investigations measured in years rather than months. The corridors were wider than standard military construction, lined with acoustic dampening materials disguised as abstract artwork that served dual purposes of aesthetic appeal and sound absorption. Everything designed to project calm authority, the kind of environment where billion-dollar procurement decisions were made over coffee and handshakes between people whose names never appeared in newspapers, where the real business of national defense happened far from public scrutiny or congressional oversight. Before we reveal exactly how Admiral Morrison's lesson backfired so spectacularly that it destroyed everything he'd spent 3 decades building, make sure you're subscribed to this channel and hit that notification bell. What happens next will show you why some people mistake silence for weakness, and why that mistake can be fatal to their careers. Lieutenant Commander Sterling had navigated these corridors many times before, though never as the primary subject of a meeting she hadn't requested and couldn't explain. Her orders had been specific but deliberately vague. Report to Admiral Morrison for urgent consultation on overseas intelligence protocols. Bring all relevant files. Prepare for extended discussion. Standard bureaucratic language that could mean anything from routine briefing to career-ending investigation, depending entirely on the Admiral's mood and motivations. The elevator to the 7th floor required 2 different security cards and a biometric scan that logged her entry with timestamp precision. Sterling's clearance granted access, though the system recorded every detail of her presence in databases that would preserve this information long after whatever happened in Conference Room Delta 7 was forgotten by everyone except the participants. The walls here were different, thicker, lined with materials specifically designed to prevent electronic surveillance from any source not explicitly authorized by the facility's security protocols. Admiral Morrison had chosen this location with deliberate care. Room Delta 7 was officially designated for compartmented briefings requiring absolute privacy, the kind of discussions where national security took precedence over standard military procedures. Unofficially, it was where careers got shaped and reshaped, where officers learned which regulations applied to them and which existed for other people. The room's isolation wasn't accidental. It was functional, designed for conversations that couldn't happen anywhere else in the command structure. Drop a comment telling us if you've ever encountered someone who used their position of authority to cross boundaries they had no right to cross, and smash that like button if you think what happened next was exactly what Admiral Morrison deserved. Sterling had studied the facility's layout during her security briefing 20 months earlier when her assignment to the Intelligence Division first brought her to Crimson Bay. Standard procedure for anyone with her clearance level, though most officers treated such briefings as routine rather than tactical preparation. She'd noted the exits, the surveillance coverage, the emergency protocols that governed everything from fire evacuation to lockdown procedures in case of security breach. Professional habit developed through years of training that emphasized knowing your environment before you needed that knowledge to survive. The hallway outside Delta 7 was empty at 0900 hours, which wasn't unusual for a Wednesday morning when most briefings occurred in the larger conference facilities on lower floors. But Sterling registered the absence of foot traffic, the closed doors of adjacent offices, the particular silence that suggested careful scheduling rather than coincidental timing. Admiral Morrison had wanted privacy, and privacy in a place like Crimson Bay required advanced planning and administrative authority that reached beyond standard command structure. What Lieutenant Commander Sterling didn't know as she approached that fateful meeting was that she was walking into a trap that had been carefully constructed by someone who'd perfected his predatory techniques over decades of unchallenged authority, someone who'd learned to use the military's hierarchical structure as a weapon against the very people it was supposed to protect, someone who was about to discover that his latest target possessed capabilities that would turn his hunting ground into his graveyard. Continue to Part 3. Before we show you exactly how Admiral Morrison revealed his true intentions and why Lieutenant Commander Sterling's response would become legendary throughout the naval intelligence community, make sure you're following our channel. Trust us, what happens in the next part will leave you speechless. The briefing room contained no windows, no secretary stationed outside, no intercom system that would carry voices beyond the soundproof walls lined with classified material warnings and electromagnetic interference shielding, just thick steel doors that locked from the inside, mahogany paneling that absorbed sound, and surveillance cameras that Admiral Morrison had discreetly disabled with a code sequence known only to flag officers with his level of clearance. Lieutenant Commander Sterling realized this isolation wasn't accidental the moment Morrison moved from behind his desk. The way he'd positioned himself between her and the only exit, the casual manner in which he'd loosened his tie after dismissing his aide, the particular smile that spread across his face when he mentioned teaching lessons. None of this was improvised. This was planned, rehearsed, the kind of moment that happened when powerful men grew comfortable with the belief that their authority extended beyond professional boundaries into personal territory they had no right to claim. Sterling had encountered predators before in places that didn't appear on any official map, where men confused rank with permission and authority with ownership. But finding herself in this situation within an American naval facility, confronting a decorated admiral who should have embodied the military's highest ideals, carried a particular sting of betrayal that cut deeper than enemy bullets ever had. "You know what your problem is, Sterling?" Morrison said, his voice taking on the patronizing tone of someone who'd delivered this speech before. "You think that because you've got some overseas experience, because you've got a few commendations on your chest, you can speak to a superior officer like we're equals." He took another step closer, close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath, close enough that his proximity became a form of intimidation designed to compress her options and cloud her judgment. "But we're not equals, Lieutenant Commander, not even close." Before we reveal how Sterling's training kicked in and why Admiral Morrison was about to learn the most expensive lesson of his life, drop a comment telling us what you think someone should do when authority figures abuse their power. And smash that like button if you believe that real strength comes from protecting others, not intimidating them. The space between them compressed to less than 3 feet. In any other context, among any other people, that distance would have been a clear violation of personal boundaries. But here, in this locked room, with his 3 stars against her silver oak leaves, it became something more sinister, a demonstration of power that relied on her unwillingness to escalate a situation that could destroy her career with a single phone call. Sterling remained seated, hands folded in her lap, posture unchanged. Her training had taught her to read situations, to assess threats, to calculate odds before they became action. What she read in Admiral Morrison's posture, in the predatory stillness of his movements, in the way his eyes had changed from professional irritation to something hungrier, told her this wasn't about military discipline anymore. This was about a man who'd confused his rank with permission, his authority with entitlement, his position with the right to do whatever he wanted to. whoever he wanted. "I think there's been a misunderstanding, sir," she said, her voice level and professional, giving him one last opportunity to step back from whatever line he was approaching. "Perhaps we should continue this discussion with your aide present or reschedule for a time when—" "There's no misunderstanding," Morrison interrupted, his smile widening in a way that made Sterling's skin crawl. "And there's no rescheduling. You see, Lieutenant Commander, respect isn't something you get to negotiate. It's something you give, whether you want to or not." He reached out and placed his hand on her shoulder, fingers pressing down with deliberate weight that had nothing to do with military protocol and everything to do with establishing ownership. And sometimes when junior officers forget their place, senior officers need to remind them exactly where they stand in the chain of command. The contact lasted exactly 4 seconds, long enough for Sterling to register the pressure, the possessiveness, the clear message that this touch was happening because he wanted it to happen, not because any regulation required it. Long enough for her to understand that Admiral Morrison had done this before to other women in other rooms, with the same confidence that came from knowing the system would protect the powerful and silence the vulnerable. She stood slowly, carefully, moving with the controlled precision of someone who understood that every gesture from this point forward would either escalate or de-escalate a situation that had already moved far beyond anything that should happen between uniformed officers. Her movement forced Morrison to step back slightly, breaking the unwanted contact, creating space that felt both like victory and like the setup for something worse. "Sir, I'm going to ask you to maintain appropriate distance and professional conduct," she said. Her words clipped and formal, the kind of language designed to create a paper trail if this ever reached an official inquiry. "This conversation has moved outside the bounds of appropriate interaction, and I believe we should—" The slap came before she finished the sentence. Not his fist yet, that would come later. Just his open palm across her cheek, sharp and sudden and designed to shock rather than seriously injure. The sound echoed off the mahogany walls like a gunshot, and for a moment the room held that particular silence that follows violence, the kind of stillness that feels like the world holding its breath. "Don't you ever," Morrison said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than shouting, "presume to tell me what is and isn't appropriate in my own briefing room." He flexed his fingers, the threat implicit but unmistakable. "You're going to learn some respect, Lieutenant Commander. The easy way or the hard way. Your choice." That was when Sterling understood that Admiral Garrett Morrison had fundamentally miscalculated who he was dealing with. That the woman standing in front of him wasn't some fresh academy graduate who could be intimidated into silence. That her service record, which he'd clearly never bothered to read beyond the surface details, contained classifications and commendations that would have given any rational person serious pause before deciding to corner her with no witnesses and no escape route. But Admiral Morrison wasn't being rational. He was being predatory. And predators, Sterling had learned in places much more dangerous than Pentagon briefing rooms, only understood one language. She smiled. The smile wasn't what Admiral Morrison expected. It wasn't submission, wasn't fear, wasn't even defiance in the way he understood it. It was something else entirely, something that made the temperature in the room shift in a direction he couldn't quite identify. Lieutenant Commander Sterling's expression held the kind of calm that comes from knowing something your opponent doesn't. The particular stillness of someone who'd been underestimated so consistently that they'd learned to use it as a tactical advantage. "You know, Admiral," she said, her voice carrying a conversational tone that seemed wildly inappropriate for a woman who'd just been struck by a superior officer, "I've been in situations where men thought they held all the cards before." She tilted her head slightly, studying his face with the clinical interest of someone examining a specimen. It's fascinating how authority can make people feel invincible, right up until the moment they discover they're not. Morrison felt something flicker in his chest. Not quite alarm, but a recognition that this wasn't playing out according to the script he'd used successfully before. Other women had responded to that slap with tears, with stammered apologies, with the kind of broken submission that fed his need for dominance. But Sterling stood there like she was evaluating him, like she was making calculations he couldn't follow, like she knew something about the next 5 minutes that he didn't. And for the first time in 32 years of military service, Admiral Garrett Morrison began to suspect that he might have made a serious mistake. Morrison's confidence began to fracture as he processed Sterling's reaction, though he couldn't quite articulate why her calm unsettled him more than screaming would have. The briefing room seemed smaller now, the mahogany walls pressing closer as the dynamic between them shifted in ways he hadn't anticipated. He'd orchestrated this moment carefully, the isolated location, the disabled surveillance, the locked door, the gradual escalation from professional conversation to personal intimidation. Everything had proceeded according to his established pattern, the same sequence that had worked with Commander Phillips 6 months ago, with Lieutenant Torres the year before, with others whose names he barely remembered because their compliance had been so predictable. But Sterling wasn't following the script. She wasn't backing down, wasn't pleading, wasn't offering the kind of desperate negotiations he'd learned to expect from cornered officers who understood that their careers hung in the balance. Instead, she seemed almost amused, like she was watching a performance she'd seen before and already knew how it ended. "You're wondering what makes me different," Sterling said, taking a half step to the left in what appeared to be casual movement, but actually improved her positioning relative to the door and Morrison's bodyguards stationed outside. "You're thinking that maybe I don't understand the situation, that maybe I haven't grasped exactly how much power you have in this building, in this command structure, in this entire naval apparatus that could crush me with a phone call." Morrison straightened, his confidence returning as she seemed to acknowledge the reality of their respective positions. This was more familiar territory, the moment when his targets began to understand the futility of resistance, when they started calculating the cost of fighting against someone with his connections, his influence, his ability to destroy careers with administrative efficiency. "Now you're getting it," he said, his smile returning with renewed arrogance. "You're finally starting to understand how things work at this level. Smart girl, I was beginning to think you might do something we'd both regret." He moved closer again, emboldened by what he interpreted as her acceptance of the inevitable. "So here's what's going to happen. You're going to apologize for your disrespectful behavior. You're going to show me exactly how sorry you are, and then we're going to forget this conversation ever happened, along with those modifications you suggested to my operational directives." Before we reveal the moment Admiral Morrison realized he'd made the biggest mistake of his career, make sure you're subscribed and tell us in the comments if you've ever seen someone's overconfidence backfire spectacularly. What happens next will show you why underestimating someone can be the most dangerous mistake you'll ever make. Sterling nodded slowly, as if considering his proposal with the seriousness it deserved. "That's an interesting offer, Admiral, very comprehensive. You've clearly thought this through." She paused, her eyes never leaving his face. "There's just one small problem with your plan." "What's that?" Morrison asked, though his tone suggested he wasn't genuinely interested in her objections. The question was rhetorical, the kind of indulgent inquiry a cat might make before finishing off a mouse. "You never asked about my background," Sterling replied, her voice taking on an almost educational quality. like she was explaining a simple concept to someone who'd missed an obvious detail. You saw Lieutenant Commander. You saw the surface credentials. You saw what looked like a standard intelligence officer with overseas experience, but you never dug deeper into what kind of overseas experience. Something cold moved through Morrison's stomach, a whisper of intuition that suggested he might have overlooked something important. But it was too late to reconsider now, too late to back down from a confrontation he'd initiated and escalated past the point of retreat. His reputation, his authority, his entire understanding of his place in the hierarchy depended on maintaining dominance in moments like this. "I don't care about your background," he said, though his voice carried less conviction than it had moments earlier. "Whatever you think you've done, wherever you think you've been, it doesn't matter in this room. In here, I'm the only authority that counts." Sterling's smile widened, and for the first time, Morrison noticed something predatory in it, something that reminded him of expressions he'd seen on the faces of special operations personnel, the kind of people who dealt with problems that required solutions the regular military preferred not to discuss. "That's where you're wrong, Admiral," she said, her tone shifting from conversational to something harder, something that carried the weight of experience gained in places where mistakes weren't just career-ending, they were fatal. "You see, for the last 10 years, I haven't been stationed anywhere that appears on official deployment records. I haven't been writing intelligence reports from behind a desk in Norfolk or any other place where people wear dress blues and worry about fitness reports." Morrison felt his confidence beginning to crack, though he couldn't quite identify why. There was something in her posture now, something in the way she held her hands, something in her eyes that suggested she was no longer the cornered officer he'd thought he was intimidating. She looked like someone who'd been waiting for him to finish talking so she could get to work. "I've been in places where rank doesn't matter," Sterling continued, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow filled the entire room. "Where protocols don't exist, where the only thing that keeps you alive is being better, faster, and more ruthless than everyone else trying to kill you. And Admiral, in those places, men who think they can take whatever they want don't get administrative reprimands or career counseling. They get educated in ways they remember for the rest of their lives." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge, fundamentally altering the dynamics Morrison thought he understood. He'd built his approach on assumptions about Sterling's background, her capabilities, her willingness to fight back against superior authority. But every word she spoke suggested those assumptions had been catastrophically wrong. "You're bluffing," he said, though uncertainty crept into his voice, for the first time since their confrontation began. "You're trying to intimidate me with stories about some imaginary special operations background. But this isn't some foreign battlefield, sweetheart. This is an American naval facility, and I'm a 3-star admiral with 32 years of service." Sterling tilted her head, studying him with the clinical interest of a predator evaluating prey. "You know what the difference is between you and the men I've dealt with overseas, Admiral? They were honest about what they were. They didn't hide behind uniforms and regulations and patriotic speeches. They were just killers who wanted to hurt people, and everyone knew exactly what they were dealing with." Her voice carried a quality Morrison had never heard before. Not anger, not fear, but something colder and infinitely more dangerous. Professional assessment delivered with surgical precision. "But you," she continued, "you've spent 32 years pretending to be something honorable while using your authority to prey on women who trusted the system to protect them. You've perverted everything this uniform is supposed to represent. And that, Admiral Morrison, makes you worse than any enemy I've ever faced." Morrison felt the first genuine flicker of alarm since the confrontation began. Something in Sterling's tone, in her body language, in the way the very air in the room seemed to change around her, suggested he was no longer dealing with a subordinate officer who could be intimidated into compliance. He was dealing with something else entirely, something that had been carefully contained within the framework of military discipline and professional courtesy, but was now considering whether those constraints still applied. And for the first time in his career, Admiral Garrett Morrison began to understand that his next decision might determine whether he walked out of this room under his own power. Morrison's hands trembled slightly as he processed Sterling's words, though he fought to maintain the facade of control that had served him throughout his career. The briefing room felt different now, not the familiar territory where he'd successfully intimidated subordinates for decades, but something closer to a trap that was slowly closing around him. Yet retreat wasn't an option. Too much had been said. Too many lines had been crossed to allow for face-saving withdrawal from a confrontation that would define the remainder of his military service. His entire identity was built on the foundation of unchallenged authority, and acknowledging Sterling's implicit threat would shatter everything he'd spent 32 years constructing. "You're making a serious mistake, Lieutenant Commander," he said, though his voice carried a note of desperation that hadn't been there minutes earlier. "Threatening a flag officer is a court-martial offense. Whatever you think you're capable of, whatever stories you're telling yourself about your background, the reality is that you're one phone call away from spending the rest of your career in military prison." He moved toward his desk, where a secure communications device would allow him to summon security forces that could end this confrontation decisively. But Sterling's next words stopped him mid-step. "Admiral, do you know what happened to Colonel Viktor Petrov in Montenegro 3 years ago?" The question seemed to come from nowhere, delivered with casual precision that suggested significance Morrison couldn't immediately grasp. He'd never heard of any Colonel Petrov, had no knowledge of operations in Montenegro, couldn't understand why Sterling was introducing topics that had nothing to do with their current situation. "I have no idea what you're talking about," he said, though something in her tone suggested this wasn't a random change of subject. "Colonel Petrov thought his rank made him untouchable, too," Sterling continued, her voice carrying the matter-of-fact quality of someone recounting historical events, rather than making threats. "He had a habit of using his authority to corner female subordinates in isolated locations, thought his connections in the Serbian military would protect him from consequences." She took a step closer to Morrison, moving with fluid precision that suggested complete confidence in her physical capabilities. The difference was that Colonel Petrov was honest about what he was doing. He didn't pretend it was about military discipline or professional correction. He just took what he wanted and relied on institutional power to cover his tracks. Morrison felt something cold spreading through his chest as Sterling continued her narrative, though he couldn't yet understand why this story felt like a personal threat rather than abstract history lesson. The problem for Colonel Petrov was that one of his targets wasn't actually a subordinate, Sterling said. "She was someone like me, operating under deep cover, someone whose real background included capabilities he never bothered to investigate, someone who'd been trained to handle predators who thought their authority made them immune to justice." The implications of Sterling's story began crystallizing in Morrison's mind, though he resisted accepting what seemed like an impossible scenario. The idea that a lieutenant commander in the United States Navy might possess the kind of background Sterling was implying challenged everything he understood about military personnel management and operational security. Before we reveal exactly what happened to Colonel Petrov and why Admiral Morrison should have been paying much closer attention to Sterling's personnel file, drop a comment telling us if you think some people need to learn the hard way that power doesn't equal permission. and smash that like button if you believe justice sometimes comes from unexpected directions. "What happened to this colonel?" Morrison asked, though he wasn't entirely sure he wanted to hear the answer. Sterling's expression remained neutral, professional, as if she were briefing senior leadership on operational outcomes rather than describing what sounded increasingly like a personal threat. Colonel Petrov was found unconscious in his private office at the Podgorica military complex. Security cameras had been disabled, his personal guards had been neutralized non-lethally, and he'd suffered what medical personnel described as precisely applied trauma consistent with professional combat training. Morrison's throat felt dry as he processed the clinical details Sterling recounted with such casual expertise. "The interesting part," she continued, "was that Colonel Petrov survived the encounter completely intact physically. No permanent damage, no serious injuries, nothing that would show up on medical examinations weeks later. But something about the experience changed his behavior permanently. He never again used his position to intimidate female personnel. In fact, he became quite vocal about the importance of protecting subordinates from predatory authority figures." The parallel between Sterling's story and their current situation was becoming impossible to ignore, though Morrison's mind recoiled from accepting that he might be facing someone capable of the actions she was describing. "You're talking about assault," he said, though his voice lacked the outrage such an accusation should have carried. "You're describing criminal conduct by military personnel." Sterling nodded as if agreeing with his legal analysis. "That's one way to interpret the situation. Another way would be to recognize that Colonel Petrov received education about the appropriate use of military authority, delivered by someone qualified to provide that education through methods that ensured the lesson would be remembered permanently." She moved closer again, and Morrison noticed that her positioning now placed her between him and both the door and his communications equipment. Not obviously threatening, but strategically advantageous in ways that suggested tactical thinking rather than casual conversation. "The really interesting part about Colonel Petrov's education," Sterling continued, "was how it affected behavior throughout his entire command structure. Once word spread about what had happened, and in military communities, word always spreads, other officers became much more careful about how they exercised their authority over subordinate personnel." Morrison felt trapped between competing impulses, the desperate need to reassert his dominance over a situation that was spiraling beyond his control, and growing recognition that Sterling represented a threat unlike anything he'd encountered in 3 decades of military service. "What exactly are you suggesting, Lieutenant Commander?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Sterling's smile returned, though it carried no warmth whatsoever. "I'm not suggesting anything, Admiral. I'm simply sharing historical information about what happens when predatory authority figures encounter personnel with the training and authorization to provide corrective education." The phrase corrective education hung between them like a loaded weapon, its implications clear despite the euphemistic language Sterling employed. "You see," she continued, "people like me exist specifically to handle problems that can't be resolved through normal administrative channels. When authority figures abuse their positions in ways that threaten operational security or unit cohesion, when the institutional protection mechanisms fail to address predatory behavior, when careers and lives are destroyed by people who think their rank exempts them from basic human decency, that's when specialists like me get activated." Morrison's understanding of their situation crystallized with terrifying clarity. He wasn't facing a subordinate officer who could be intimidated into silence. He was confronting someone whose actual mission parameters might include neutralizing threats like him. and he'd just provided her with legal justification for whatever came next. Morrison's face drained of color as the full implications of Sterling's revelation settled into his consciousness like poison spreading through his bloodstream. The woman standing before him wasn't just another naval officer with overseas experience. She was something far more dangerous, someone whose presence at Crimson Bay represented operational capabilities he'd never considered when planning his assault. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly as he struggled to process information that fundamentally altered every assumption he'd made about their encounter. The careful isolation he'd arranged, the disabled surveillance systems, the locked doors, all the precautions that had made previous assaults possible, now trapped him alone with someone whose training specifically prepared her to handle predators like him. "That's impossible," he whispered, though even as the words left his mouth, Morrison knew he was grasping at denial rather than stating facts. Naval intelligence officers don't receive that kind of training. There are protocols, oversight committees, congressional authorization requirements. Sterling's expression shifted to something that might have been pity if it hadn't been so clinical. "Admiral, you're thinking about the military, you know, the one with organizational charts and bureaucratic procedures and accountability measures. But there's another military, one that operates in spaces between official acknowledgement and plausible deniability." She reached into her uniform pocket with movements so casual Morrison didn't recognize them as tactical until she was holding something in her palm. A small device, matte black ceramic with indicators that suggested active recording capabilities. "Voice-activated recorder, military grade, admissible as evidence in courts-martial proceedings," she said, her tone carrying the matter-of-fact quality of someone providing technical specifications. "Everything you've said and done in this room has been documented with time-stamp precision that will eliminate any ambiguity about sequence of events or criminal intent." Morrison stared at the device, his mind racing through implications he hadn't considered when he'd disabled the room's official surveillance systems. His careful preparation had eliminated institutional monitoring, but he'd never anticipated personal recording equipment that would capture conversations he'd assumed would remain private. The device represented evidence that could destroy his career, regardless of Sterling's credibility or his ability to influence investigative procedures. Audio documentation of sexual assault, attempted rape, and abuse of authority. Crimes that carried sentences measured in decades rather than years, especially when committed by flag officers whose oaths included specific pledges to protect those under their command. That's not possible," Morrison stammered, though the denial sounded hollow even to his own ears. "Personal recording devices aren't authorized in classified briefing facilities. Security protocols specifically prohibit. Personal recording devices aren't authorized for most personnel," Sterling corrected, her voice carrying the patience of someone explaining technical details to a civilian. "But my operational clearance includes authorization for evidence collection in situations involving security violations, criminal conduct, or threats to operational integrity, which this situation definitely qualifies as, Admiral." The revelation changed everything Morrison thought he understood about their encounter. Sterling hadn't been trapped by his careful preparation. She'd been conducting an investigation that documented his crimes with precision that would make prosecution straightforward regardless of his institutional connections or political influence. Before we show you exactly how Admiral Morrison's desperation led to the mistake that ended his career, make sure you're subscribed and drop a comment telling us what you think should happen to authority figures who abuse their power. What comes next will prove that sometimes justice arrives in ways bullies never see coming. Morrison felt the walls of the briefing room closing in around him as the magnitude of his miscalculation became clear. Every word he'd spoken, every inappropriate touch, every explicit threat had been recorded with digital precision that would eliminate the ambiguity that had protected him in previous encounters. The evidence Sterling possessed would make denial impossible and legal defense virtually hopeless. "You can't use that recording," he said, desperation creeping into his voice. "It was obtained without my knowledge or consent. Any competent military lawyer would have it excluded from evidence on procedural grounds. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us." Now, back to the story. Sterling's smile widened, and Morrison noticed that her expression held the particular satisfaction of someone who'd anticipated every possible objection. "Actually, Admiral, my authorization includes exemption from standard consent requirements when documenting criminal activity by senior military personnel. The recording is not only admissible, it's legally protected evidence that can't be suppressed, regardless of procedural challenges." Morrison's legs felt weak as he realized that Sterling had outmaneuvered him completely, turning his own carefully planned assault into documented evidence of federal crimes. But recognition of his legal vulnerability only intensified his desperation rather than encouraging retreat from the confrontation he'd initiated. "Nobody will believe that recording represents the full context," he said, though his voice carried little conviction. "A few minutes of audio can be edited, manipulated, taken out of context. My 32 years of unblemished service against the word of a junior officer with questionable judgment." "Questionable judgment?" Sterling interrupted, and for the first time, Morrison heard genuine emotion in her voice. Not fear or submission, but something colder and infinitely more dangerous. "Admiral, questionable judgment is what you demonstrated when you decided to assault someone without bothering to investigate who you were really dealing with." She took another step closer, and Morrison noticed that her movements carried the fluid precision of someone trained in close-quarters combat. "You see, my personnel file contains information you never bothered to access. Classifications that require special authorization to review, operational histories that exist in databases you don't have clearance to examine." Morrison felt panic rising in his throat as Sterling continued speaking with the calm authority of someone who held all the tactical advantages. "For the last decade, I've been assigned to Joint Special Operations Command, working under non-official cover in regions where American personnel officially don't operate. My actual military occupational specialty involves what the Pentagon euphemistically calls kinetic problem resolution, eliminating threats to national security through direct action when diplomatic or legal remedies prove insufficient." The clinical terminology couldn't disguise what Sterling was describing, and Morrison felt his remaining composure cracking as he processed the implications of her revelation. He wasn't confronting a standard intelligence officer who could be intimidated through institutional pressure. He was facing someone whose actual job involved neutralizing threats like him. "You're telling me you're an assassin," he said, though the word felt inadequate for describing the professional capabilities Sterling was claiming. "I'm telling you I'm someone who specializes in handling predators who use institutional authority to harm others," Sterling replied. "Someone who's been trained to recognize, document, and neutralize threats to operational security and unit cohesion. Someone who's encountered men exactly like you in places where they couldn't hide behind rank or political connections." Morrison's hand moved instinctively toward the communications device on his desk, some desperate part of his mind still believing that summoning security forces might salvage a situation that had moved far beyond Institutional solutions. Sterling noticed the movement immediately. Admiral, I wouldn't recommend trying to call for help. Your security detail is trained to protect you from external threats, but they're not equipped to handle someone with my background operating under legal authority to document and respond to criminal conduct. Morrison's hand froze mid-reach as he realized that Sterling was right. His bodyguards were positioned to prevent attacks from outside the facility, not to manage confrontations with personnel who possessed legitimate authorization to be in restricted areas. And Sterling had just made it clear that whatever happened next would be legally justified as self-defense against criminal assault. Morrison's desperation peaked as he recognized that all his carefully constructed advantages had been turned against him. But instead of accepting defeat, panic drove him toward the final mistake that would transform their confrontation from criminal assault into something far more decisive. His hand clenched into a fist, and Admiral Garrett Morrison prepared to learn why underestimating Lieutenant Commander Sterling had been the worst mistake of his military career. The transformation in Morrison's demeanor was complete now, desperation replacing the calculated confidence that had characterized his approach for the past hour. His face flushed red with a combination of rage and panic as the reality of his situation crystallized. He was trapped in a room with someone who possessed both the capability and legal authorization to end his career, his freedom, and possibly his life. But rather than attempting damage control or negotiating retreat from the confrontation he'd initiated, Morrison's psychology defaulted to the aggressive patterns that had defined his relationship with subordinates throughout his career. When faced with resistance, he escalated. When challenged by evidence, he attacked the messenger. When confronted with consequences for his actions, he doubled down on the authority he believed made him untouchable. "You think you're so clever," he snarled, his voice losing all pretense of military professionalism. "Walking in here with your recording devices and your special operations stories, thinking you can intimidate me with tales about foreign colonels and covert operations. But you've made one critical mistake, Lieutenant Commander." Sterling remained motionless, though Morrison noticed her breathing had shifted to the deep, controlled pattern of someone preparing for physical exertion. Her hands stayed folded, but there was something different about her posture now, a readiness that hadn't been visible during their verbal sparring. "The mistake," Morrison continued, moving closer, despite every instinct that should have warned him to maintain distance, "is thinking that your little recording will matter once you're dead. Audio evidence becomes irrelevant when the only witness suffers a tragic accident during what was obviously a consensual encounter that went wrong." The threat was explicit now, eliminating any remaining ambiguity about Morrison's intentions. He'd moved beyond sexual assault into territory that included potential murder, apparently believing that eliminating Sterling would resolve the legal complications her evidence created. Sterling's expression didn't change, but Morrison caught a flicker of something in her eyes. Not fear, but what might have been professional disappointment at his predictable escalation to lethal threats. "Admiral," she said quietly, "you should know that my authorization includes real-time data transmission. Everything that's happened in this room has already been uploaded to secure servers monitored by personnel who specialize in protecting assets like me. Your threat to kill me just upgraded this situation from criminal assault to potential homicide, which activates response protocols you really don't want to trigger." Before we reveal how Admiral Morrison's final desperate gambit sealed his fate, make sure you're following our channel and drop a comment telling us if you've ever seen someone dig their own grave with their words. What happens next will show you why some mistakes can never be undone. Morrison felt a moment of genuine terror as Sterling's words registered, but panic had driven him beyond rational calculation. The idea that their confrontation was being monitored by external agencies, that his threats were being documented in real time by people with authority to intervene, should have convinced him to surrender immediately. Instead, desperation convinced him that his only remaining option was to eliminate the threat Sterling represented before her mysterious support network could respond to his escalating criminal behavior. "You're bluffing," he said, though uncertainty made his voice crack. "If you really had that kind of backup, if people were really monitoring this conversation, they would have intervened already. You're alone in here with me, just like I planned." Sterling tilted her head slightly, studying Morrison with the clinical interest of someone observing a specimen that had behaved exactly as predicted. "Admiral, the reason nobody has intervened yet is because my handlers are waiting to see how far you'll take this. Your behavior is providing valuable intelligence about how predators like you operate within military command structures." Morrison's face contorted with rage as he processed the implication that their entire encounter had been orchestrated not by him, but by Sterling and whatever organization had deployed her to Crimson Bay. The careful isolation he'd arranged, the disabled surveillance, the locked doors, none of it had trapped Sterling. It had trapped him in a controlled environment where his criminal tendencies could be documented with precision that would support systemic reforms to prevent future predators from operating with impunity. "You set me up," he whispered, the full magnitude of his miscalculation finally becoming clear. "This whole thing was planned. You knew exactly what I was going to do." Sterling nodded, as if acknowledging an obvious observation. "Admiral, men like you are remarkably predictable. Your behavioral patterns have been studied, analyzed, and documented by people whose job it is to understand how institutional predators operate. Everything you've done tonight follows a script we've seen hundreds of times before." Morrison felt the last vestiges of his authority crumbling as Sterling revealed the systematic nature of whatever operation had targeted him. He wasn't facing a random encounter with an unusually capable subordinate. He was confronting a deliberately planned investigation that had used his own predatory instincts against him. "The difference," Sterling continued, "is that this time the target had resources you didn't anticipate, training you couldn't overcome, authority that superseded your institutional protection, and evidence that will ensure you face consequences that other predators have avoided through political connections and administrative cover-ups." Morrison's hand shook as he realized that every advantage he'd believed he possessed, the isolated location, the disabled surveillance, the absence of witnesses, had been turned into tactical advantages for Sterling's operation. His careful preparation had created the perfect environment for documenting his crimes with unambiguous clarity, but accepting defeat wasn't in Morrison's psychological makeup. 32 years of unchallenged authority had convinced him that force could overcome any obstacle, that superior rank justified any action, that consequences were for other people who lacked his connections and influence. His military training, corrupted by decades of abuse and entitlement, told him that eliminating threats was preferable to accepting accountability. If Sterling represented an existential threat to his career and freedom, then Sterling needed to be neutralized regardless of the legal or moral implications. Morrison's rational mind knew that attacking Sterling would only provide additional evidence of his criminal intent, while potentially triggering the response protocols she'd described. But panic had overridden rational thought, leaving only desperate aggression and the belief that violence could still salvage a situation that had moved far beyond salvage. "Last chance, Lieutenant Commander," he said, his voice carrying the particular menace of someone who'd committed to a course of action regardless of consequences. "Delete that recording, forget everything that happened here, and we can both walk away from this situation without anyone getting hurt." Sterling's smile returned, though it held no warmth whatsoever. "Admiral, the only person who's going to get hurt here is the one who's stupid enough to assault someone with my background and authorization. And unfortunately for you, that appears to be exactly what you're planning to do." Morrison's vision narrowed to tunnel focus as adrenaline flooded his system, preparing him for what he believed would be a simple physical confrontation between a larger, stronger male and a smaller female who'd relied too heavily on psychological intimidation. He'd never been more wrong about anything in his military career. Admiral Garrett Morrison clenched his fist and stepped forward, completely unaware that he was about to provide Lieutenant Commander Sterling with legal justification for demonstrating exactly why underestimating her had been a fatal mistake. Morrison's fist cut through the air with all the authority he'd accumulated over 3 decades of military service, driven by rage and desperation and the particular fury of someone who'd just realized his carefully constructed world was collapsing around him. His punch carried the weight of 3 stars, the momentum of unchecked power, and the violence of a predator whose territory had been invaded by something he'd fundamentally failed to understand. But physics operates according to principles that don't recognize military rank or institutional authority, and Morrison had just initiated contact with someone whose understanding of violence had been refined in places where mistakes weren't career-ending. They were fatal. Sterling's response was immediate and surgical, transforming Morrison's aggression into a lesson in applied biomechanics that would be analyzed by military medical personnel for months afterward. Her left hand intercepted Morrison's wrist mid-swing, fingers locking around bone and tendon with pressure that stopped his punch before it reached her face. Not a desperate block or lucky deflection, but calculated interception that demonstrated she'd been tracking his movement from the moment his shoulders telegraphed his intention. Her grip positioned with anatomical precision, compressing nerve clusters responsible for motor control and rendering his fist harmless while maintaining complete control over his arm's trajectory. Simultaneously, her right hand drove upward in a palm strike that connected with Morrison's chin at precisely the angle required to transfer maximum kinetic energy to his brainstem. Not the wild haymaker of someone fighting for survival, but surgical application of force designed to achieve specific neurological results. The impact sent shockwaves through Morrison's nervous system that disrupted electrical signals between brain and body, creating momentary paralysis that left him conscious but unable to coordinate movement. His legs buckled as his balance center struggled to process conflicting sensory input, the room tilting sideways in ways that defied his understanding of physics. Sterling maintained control of his captured arm while he fell, using his own weight to guide his descent in directions that prevented him from striking furniture or injuring himself beyond the damage she'd already calculated as necessary. Her movements flowed with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd performed similar techniques countless times under conditions far more challenging than Pentagon briefing rooms. Morrison hit the marble floor with the dull thud of dead weight, his body betraying him completely as Sterling's precisely applied force achieved exactly the neurological disruption she'd intended. His vision blurred as his brain attempted to reconcile the disconnect between what his eyes were seeing and what his inner ear was reporting. But Sterling wasn't finished because Morrison wasn't unconscious, and conscious predators represented ongoing threats that required complete neutralization. As his body settled against the polished floor in what appeared to be uncontrolled collapse, she followed him down with movement that looked casual but was actually tactical positioning designed to maintain dominance while preventing recovery. Before we reveal the surgical precision of Sterling's final technique and why Admiral Morrison would wake up with a completely new perspective on the appropriate use of military authority. Make sure you're subscribed and tell us in the comments if you think some people need to learn respect the hard way. What happens next will show you exactly why underestimating someone can be the last mistake you ever make. Her knee found the pressure point behind Morrison's ear with mathematical precision, applying exactly enough pressure to compress the carotid artery without causing permanent damage. The technique was called a blood choke in combat training, though Sterling's education had included the clinical terminology and physiological mechanisms that made it effective. Properly applied pressure to the carotid artery reduced blood flow to the brain by approximately 70%, causing unconsciousness within 3 to 7 seconds, depending on the target's physical condition and stress response. Morrison struggled briefly, his hands clawing at her leg, with diminishing coordination as oxygen deprivation took effect. But his efforts were futile against someone who'd been trained to apply chokes, against opponents who'd been specifically trained to resist them. Sterling had practiced these techniques against special operations personnel, foreign intelligence agents, and combat veterans whose survival depended on their ability to escape restraint holds. Admiral Morrison's consciousness faded like a television being turned off. Not the dramatic collapse portrayed in movies, but gradual dimming of awareness that left him peaceful and still on the briefing room floor. Sterling maintained pressure for exactly 4 seconds after he stopped moving, ensuring complete unconsciousness while avoiding the brain damage that could result from prolonged compression. When she finally released the hold, Morrison breathed steadily and naturally, his pulse strong but slow, his body positioned in recovery position that would prevent aspiration if he vomited during the transition back to consciousness. The entire sequence had required less than 10 seconds, from the moment Morrison began his punch to the moment his unconscious body settled against the mahogany flooring. Sterling stood slowly, adjusting her uniform with automatic precision while conducting rapid assessment of Morrison's condition and the tactical situation that would develop when he regained consciousness. His breathing was regular, his color was good, and his pulse suggested he would wake naturally within 5 to 10 minutes, with nothing more serious than a headache and severely damaged ego. But Sterling's immediate concern wasn't Morrison's medical condition. It was the 2 bodyguards stationed outside the briefing room who would have heard the sound of their principal hitting the floor. Professional security personnel trained to respond to threats against flag officers, men who would interpret sounds of struggle as indication that their protectee required immediate assistance. Sterling moved to the door with the same controlled precision she'd applied to neutralizing Morrison, though her objectives now shifted from combat to crisis management. The recorder in her pocket had documented everything, providing evidence that would ensure legal proceedings favored accurate interpretation of events rather than institutional damage control. But evidence meant nothing if she couldn't survive the next few minutes with Morrison's bodyguards, who would see their unconscious principal and draw conclusions that might not align with legal realities. Sterling positioned herself beside the door, calculating angles and distances, while listening for sounds that would indicate immediate response from exterior security. The room's soundproofing would have muffled most noise, but the specific impact of a 200-pound body striking marble flooring might have been audible to trained personnel whose jobs required attention to subtle audio cues that could indicate threats to their protected asset. Sterling's breathing remained controlled, her heart rate elevated but manageable, her mental state focused on tactical considerations that would determine whether this situation concluded with Morrison in custody or her in a morgue. She'd neutralized the immediate threat, but Morrison represented just one component of a larger security apparatus that included people with guns and authorization to use them if circumstances required lethal force to protect flag officer personnel. The silence outside the door stretched for several seconds, long enough for Sterling to hope the bodyguards hadn't heard Morrison fall, short enough that she remained prepared for immediate contact with armed men who might not be interested in lengthy explanations about sexual assault and justifiable self-defense. Admiral Morrison stirred slightly on the floor behind her, unconsciousness beginning its natural retreat as his brain recovered from temporary oxygen deprivation. Sterling had perhaps 3 minutes before he regained full awareness, 3 minutes to prepare for conversations that would determine whether justice or institutional protection would govern what happened next. The door handle turned with deliberate precision, and Sterling squared her shoulders to face whatever came next. The door opened with the controlled precision of security personnel trained to assess threat situations before taking action. Master Chief Petty Officer Jackson entered first, his hand resting on his holstered sidearm but not yet drawn, his eyes sweeping the room in the methodical pattern that identified exits, obstacles, and potential weapons before focusing on the unconscious admiral sprawled across the marble flooring. Behind him, Petty Officer First Class Williams maintained position in the doorway, providing cover while preventing unauthorized access to what had clearly become a crime scene, requiring immediate containment and investigation. Jackson had 24 years of experience protecting flag officers in environments ranging from Pentagon briefings to forward operating bases in hostile territory. He'd witnessed admirals collapse from medical emergencies, responded to assassination attempts against general officers, and managed security threats that required split-second decisions about when to use lethal force. But he'd never encountered a situation where his protectee was unconscious on the floor, while a female officer stood calmly beside the door, hands visible, posture relaxed, with an expression that suggested she was waiting for something rather than fleeing from something. "Ma'am, step away from Admiral Morrison and identify yourself," Jackson said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. His assessment of the scene suggested Sterling represented either a threat that had neutralized his principal or a potential victim who required protection from unknown assailants. The absence of blood or obvious trauma complicated his evaluation, as did Sterling's demeanor, which projected professional composure rather than fear or aggression. Sterling raised her hands slowly, palms visible in universal gesture of non-threatening intent. "Master Chief, I'm Lieutenant Commander Rachel Sterling, Naval Intelligence. Admiral Morrison is unconscious but stable. He'll regain consciousness within the next few minutes with no permanent injury." Her voice carried the clinical precision of someone providing medical assessment rather than the emotional distress Jackson might have expected from someone involved in violent confrontation with a flag officer. Williams's hand moved closer to his weapon as he processed Sterling's words. "Ma'am, did you assault Admiral Morrison?" he asked, though his tone suggested he was having difficulty reconciling the idea of a female lieutenant commander successfully attacking a male admiral with what his training had taught him about physical confrontations between personnel of different sizes and experience levels. "I defended myself against Admiral Morrison's physical assault after he committed sexual battery," Sterling replied, her words delivered with matter-of-fact clarity that eliminated ambiguity about her version of events. "Everything that occurred in this room has been recorded and will be submitted as evidence in the criminal proceedings that will follow this incident." Jackson felt the situation shifting in directions his security training hadn't prepared him to handle. Protection of flag officers from external threats was straightforward. Identify hostile actors and neutralize them through appropriate application of force. but scenarios where the flag officer himself was the apparent aggressor, where the potential victim had successfully defended herself, where evidence of criminal conduct might exist. These circumstances required different protocols that fell outside his areas of expertise. Before we reveal how Sterling's evidence changed everything and why Admiral Morrison's bodyguards had to choose between loyalty and justice, make sure you're subscribed and drop a comment telling us if you've ever had to choose between following orders and doing what's right. What happens next will show you that real honor sometimes means standing up to the people you're supposed to protect. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to remain in position while we secure Admiral Morrison and request medical assistance, Jackson said, though uncertainty crept into his voice as he attempted to apply standard procedures to a situation that clearly wasn't standard. His primary responsibility was ensuring Morrison's safety and well-being, but that obligation became complicated when the Admiral's condition apparently resulted from his own criminal behavior rather than external attack. Sterling nodded agreement, maintaining her position while Jackson knelt beside Morrison to assess his condition. Pulse steady, breathing regular, pupils responsive but dilated, skin color normal, all indicators of someone recovering from controlled unconsciousness rather than serious head trauma. Jackson had seen similar presentations in personnel who'd been subdued through non-lethal force by military police or security contractors, though he'd never encountered a situation where a flag officer was the recipient of such techniques. Williams, contact-based security and request immediate response from Naval Criminal Investigative Service, Jackson said, making the decision that this situation required investigation by personnel trained to handle crimes involving senior military officers. Also request medical evaluation team and legal counsel for all parties involved. This is now a potential criminal matter requiring proper documentation and chain of custody procedures. Sterling remained silent as Williams initiated communications with base security, though she noted the professional manner in which both bodyguards were handling circumstances that must have been personally and professionally challenging. Their primary loyalty was to Morrison, but their training included obligations to military justice that took precedence over personal relationships or institutional protection. Sterling retrieved the recording device from her pocket, holding it visible to both security personnel. Master Chief, this device contains complete audio documentation of Admiral Morrison's sexual assault and my defensive response. I'm prepared to provide this evidence to NCIS investigators when they arrive, along with detailed statement about the criminal conduct that occurred in this room. The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion, changing the atmosphere in ways that couldn't be reversed. Jackson and Williams exchanged glances that communicated volumes about their shared recognition that their careers had just intersected with something far more serious than routine security duty. Morrison began stirring on the floor, consciousness returning as his brain recovered from temporary oxygen deprivation. His first attempts at movement were uncoordinated, hands reaching automatically toward his head as neurological systems came back online, but his breathing remained steady and his color continued to improve. Jackson watched carefully for signs of serious head injury or complications that might require immediate medical intervention, while simultaneously processing the implications of Sterling's allegations and the evidence she claimed to possess. Ma'am, NCIS will handle evidence collection and statements from all parties, Jackson said, though his tone suggested he understood that standard procedures might prove inadequate for circumstances involving a flag officer accused of sexual assault. For now, I need everyone to remain in position until investigators arrive and can properly document the scene. Morrison opened his eyes, blinking in confusion as awareness returned, and memory began reconstructing the events that had led to his current position on the briefing room floor. His gaze found Sterling first, then shifted to his bodyguards, then back to Sterling with an expression that suggested he was beginning to understand that his carefully constructed authority had collapsed along with his consciousness. "What?" Morrison began, his voice thick and uncertain as he struggled to organize thoughts that felt fragmented and incomplete. The last clear memory he could access was throwing a punch that should have connected with Sterling's face, though obviously something had gone catastrophically wrong between intention and execution. "Admiral Morrison," Sterling said quietly, her voice carrying the same professional courtesy she'd maintained throughout their encounter, "you're under arrest." The transformation at Crimson Bay Naval Command Center would begin within hours, though the changes wouldn't be immediately visible to personnel who hadn't witnessed the confrontation in Conference Room Delta 7. But Admiral Garrett Morrison's career was over, and everyone in that room knew it. NCIS investigators arrived at Crimson Bay Naval Command Center with the methodical efficiency that characterized federal law enforcement. Responses to crimes involving flag officers, their black SUVs, and serious expressions signaled that routine military discipline had escalated into criminal proceedings that would attract attention from Pentagon leadership and congressional oversight committees. The investigation moved with unprecedented speed, driven by evidence so overwhelming that even Morrison's military counsel recommended immediate plea negotiations rather than trial proceedings that would result in public exposure of details damaging to institutional reputation and personal legacy. Sterling had spent 8 hours providing detailed testimony to investigators who recorded every word with digital precision while building case files that would determine whether Morrison faced court-martial or civilian prosecution. Her recording device provided unambiguous evidence of sexual assault, attempted rape, and abuse of authority, crimes that carried sentences measured in decades rather than years, especially when committed by officers whose oaths included specific pledges to protect those under their command. Within 72 hours, news of Morrison's arrest had spread through unofficial channels, with the speed that characterized all significant developments involving senior leadership. Officers who'd served under Morrison began reviewing their own experiences with new perspective, recognizing behavioral patterns they'd previously attributed to demanding leadership style rather than predatory opportunism. Female personnel who'd requested transfers from his command found their decisions validated by events that explained instincts they'd struggled to articulate through official complaint procedures. Commander Patricia Walsh had been among the first to contact NCIS investigators with information about Morrison's previous conduct. Her testimony described systematic harassment that had escalated over months until she'd accepted transfer to less desirable assignment rather than continue enduring behavior that made her workdays psychological endurance tests. The investigators listened with professional attention while building supplementary cases that would ensure Morrison faced consequences for crimes extending beyond his assault on Sterling. Lieutenant Sarah Chen provided similar testimony about incidents that occurred during joint training exercises, where Morrison had leveraged temporary command authority to create opportunities for inappropriate contact disguised as professional interaction. Her detailed recollections of dates, times, and witnesses provided corroborating evidence that established patterns of predatory behavior spanning multiple years and numerous victims. The psychological impact on base personnel was complex and varied, though most officers expressed relief that someone had finally held Morrison accountable for behavior that had been whispered about but never officially addressed. Junior female officers reported feeling safer, more confident that institutional protection existed for personnel who reported sexual assault rather than victims being blamed for destroying careers of respected senior leaders through accusations that couldn't be proven conclusively. Before we reveal the full extent of Morrison's downfall and how Sterling's courage inspired systematic changes throughout the Naval Command structure, make sure you're following our channel and tell us in the comments if you think justice was served. What happened next proves that sometimes one person's courage can change an entire system. Sterling returned to duty 5 days after the incident, though her routine assignments now included additional responsibilities that reflected her role as primary witness in criminal proceedings that would likely continue for months. Her presence on base carried symbolic weight that extended beyond her individual case, proof that military justice could function correctly when victims possessed evidence and courage necessary to pursue accountability through proper legal channels. The administrative aftermath proved nearly as complex as the criminal investigation itself. Morrison's immediate suspension pending trial created a leadership vacuum that required emergency appointments and restructured command authority throughout the intelligence division. His previous decisions were subjected to review that identified several instances where personal prejudices had influenced professional evaluations and assignment recommendations in ways that had damaged careers and operational effectiveness. Personnel who'd suffered under Morrison's leadership found themselves eligible for administrative relief that included corrected fitness reports, reassignment opportunities, and in some cases, financial compensation for career damage caused by his abuse of authority. The process was slow and bureaucratic, but it represented institutional acknowledgement that Morrison's crimes had extended beyond individual assault into systematic corruption of military justice that had protected him while punishing his victims. Morrison himself remained confined to military detention while awaiting trial proceedings that would determine whether he spent his remaining years in federal prison or military stockade. His fall from grace had been absolute and irreversible. Career destroyed, reputation demolished, future reduced to whatever mercy might be shown to someone who'd betrayed every principle military service claimed to represent. His legal team had attempted damage control through plea negotiations that would minimize public exposure of his crimes. But Sterling's testimony made clear she wasn't interested in quiet resolution that allowed powerful predators to disappear into retirement with benefits intact and reputations preserved through administrative discretion. The broader implications extended beyond individual justice to systematic reform that addressed environmental factors that had allowed Morrison to operate without effective oversight for decades. New reporting procedures eliminated administrative barriers that had previously discouraged victims from filing complaints, while revised investigation protocols ensured that allegations against senior officers received proper attention rather than being buried through informal peer counseling that protected perpetrators. Training programs were implemented that educated personnel about recognizing and responding to sexual harassment before it escalated to assault, while leadership development courses emphasized ethical responsibility and appropriate use of authority in ways that had been overlooked during Morrison's generation of officer education. The changes represented acknowledgement that military effectiveness required elimination of predatory behavior that undermined unit cohesion and operational security. Sterling's own career prospects had changed dramatically, though not in ways she'd anticipated when she first entered Conference Room Delta 7. Her successful defense against Morrison had attracted attention from special operations commands that recruited personnel with demonstrated capability to handle extreme situations under pressure. Multiple assignment offers had arrived from units whose work required individuals who could maintain operational security while navigating complex legal and political environments. But Sterling had chosen to remain at Crimson Bay temporarily, serving as informal mentor to female officers who were learning to recognize and report inappropriate behavior from superiors who believed rank provided immunity from consequences. Her willingness to pursue criminal charges despite personal and professional risks had inspired others to speak about experiences they'd previously kept silent, creating cultural shift that prioritized victim protection over institutional reputation management. The ripple effects continued expanding throughout the naval intelligence community as word spread about Morrison's arrest and the evidence that had made prosecution inevitable. Other flag officers began reviewing their own conduct, with new awareness that predatory behavior would no longer be protected by institutional loyalty or administrative cover-ups. The message was clear: authority came with accountability, and those who abused their power would face consequences regardless of their rank or connections. 6 months after Admiral Morrison's arrest, Sterling sat in Conference Room Delta 7 for the final time before her transfer to Joint Special Operations Command. The space felt different now, smaller somehow, less intimidating, just another meeting room where people discussed professional matters without fear that authority would be perverted into opportunity for personal gratification. The mahogany panels that had once absorbed Morrison's threats now witnessed conversations about operational improvements and personnel development initiatives that prioritized protection of subordinates over preservation of senior officer reputations. The room's isolation, once used to facilitate predatory behavior, now served its intended purpose of securing classified discussions that genuinely served national security interests. Sterling's uniform bore new ribbons that reflected commendations for courage and leadership, awards that had been presented quietly but meaningfully by commanders who understood that real strength required protection of the vulnerable rather than exploitation of power differentials. The ceremonies had been small, attended by personnel who recognized that Sterling's actions had transformed their workplace from an environment where predators operated with impunity into one where accountability superseded rank. Morrison's trial had concluded 3 weeks earlier with guilty verdicts on all charges: sexual assault, abuse of authority, conduct unbecoming an officer, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. Crimes that had earned him 25 years in federal prison without possibility of parole. The proceedings had been thorough but mercifully brief, with overwhelming evidence eliminating any possibility of acquittal or successful appeal. Sterling's testimony had been clinical and devastating, delivered with the same professional precision she'd demonstrated during their confrontation. The recording device had provided irrefutable documentation of Morrison's crimes, while additional witnesses had established patterns of predatory behavior that spanned his entire career. Military justice had functioned exactly as intended when evidence was clear and institutional protection mechanisms couldn't suppress truth. Morrison's sentencing had attracted minimal media attention, buried beneath more sensational news cycles that focused on political scandals and celebrity controversies. But within military circles, his downfall had sent shockwaves that continued reverberating through command structures at every level of service hierarchy. The institutional changes had been swift and comprehensive. New oversight mechanisms ensured that allegations against senior officers received immediate investigation by personnel with independence and authority to pursue charges regardless of political considerations. Anonymous reporting systems eliminated fear of retaliation that had previously discouraged victims from seeking justice through official channels. Most importantly, cultural transformation had begun to address underlying attitudes that had enabled predators like Morrison to operate for decades without effective challenge. Leadership development programs now emphasized ethical responsibility alongside tactical competence, while promotion boards included specific evaluation criteria related to treatment of subordinate personnel. Before we conclude this remarkable story, drop a comment telling us what lesson you'll take away from Lieutenant Commander Sterling's courage. And smash that like button if you believe that standing up to bullies, no matter how powerful they think they are, is always worth the risk. Sterling thought about the women who'd suffered under Morrison's authority, personnel whose careers had been damaged or destroyed by his abuse of power. Many had found validation through the investigation that followed his arrest, receiving administrative relief that helped repair professional damage caused by his predatory behavior. But others had already left military service, driven away by experiences that convinced them the system would never protect them from institutional predators. The changes Sterling had helped catalyze would protect future personnel from similar abuse, but they couldn't undo the damage Morrison had inflicted over 3 decades of unchecked authority. That knowledge carried weight she would bear throughout her remaining military service, understanding that justice, while essential, was often inadequate compensation for suffering that could have been prevented through earlier intervention. Her new assignment with Joint Special Operations Command would utilize skills she'd developed during her confrontation with Morrison, though in contexts that served national security rather than personal justice. The techniques she'd used to neutralize a predatory admiral would translate effectively to operations against foreign threats that required similar precision and decisiveness. But Sterling's greatest contribution might prove to be the cultural precedent she'd established, demonstrating that predatory authority figures could be held accountable regardless of their rank or institutional protection, that victims possessed options beyond silence and submission, that courage combined with evidence could achieve justice, even against seemingly untouchable adversaries. The military was transforming slowly but definitively, becoming the professional organization it had always claimed to be but hadn't always managed to achieve. Personnel at every level understood that authority came with responsibility, that power existed to protect rather than exploit, that true leadership required moral courage alongside tactical competence. Young officers entering service now did so with confidence that their institution would support them against predatory superiors, that reporting misconduct would result in investigation rather than retaliation, that careers would be built on merit rather than survival of harassment and abuse. The changes weren't complete. Institutional transformation required years rather than months, and some commands remained resistant to reforms that challenged traditional hierarchies. But momentum had been established, precedents had been set, and accountability mechanisms had proven their effectiveness against even the most powerful offenders. Sterling gathered her files and prepared to leave Conference Room Delta 7 for the final time. Tomorrow she would begin new duties that would take her back to places that didn't appear on official maps, conducting operations that required authorization far above her visible rank. But she would carry with her the knowledge that her actions in this room had contributed to something larger than individual justice, systematic change that would protect countless future personnel from predators who believed their authority exempted them from basic human decency. As she reached for the door handle, Sterling reflected on the transformation that had begun the moment Morrison threw his first punch. Justice hadn't just been about punishment. It had been about proving that predators could be stopped, that victims could fight back successfully, that institutional power couldn't protect criminals forever when their targets possessed courage and evidence necessary to pursue accountability through appropriate channels. Real strength, she'd learned, wasn't about intimidation or dominance. It was about using whatever capabilities you possessed to protect others who couldn't protect themselves. It was about standing up when standing up was difficult, speaking truth when truth was dangerous, and accepting responsibility for making the world safer for those who came after you. Justice had been served, but more importantly, transformation had begun. What do you think would have happened if Sterling had stayed silent? Could you have found the courage to stand up to someone like Admiral Morrison when the stakes were so high? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. If this story reminded you that real heroes come in all forms and that courage is contagious, smash that like button and subscribe for more stories about people who refuse to let bullies win. Hit that notification bell because tomorrow we're sharing another incredible story about someone who turned their greatest weakness into their most powerful weapon. You won't want to miss it. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.